Hi, good evening. So tonight it's 8 a.m. I'm sorry, 8 p.m. The 30th of May, 2021, and every week we like to do a sort of retrospective look back at the week. So this is the news from Zimmer and Peacock for the week starting the 24th, Monday the 24th of May, 2021, and I'm just going to sort of dive straight into it. Now I have I wouldn't say apology, but I did promise a few people online that we were going to talk about cortisol sensors tonight, and we will talk about very briefly some cortisol sensors. But I might have to, or I will have to move the majority of that, unfortunately, to the Developer Zone webinar. So we tend to do sort of news and updates from Zimmer and Peacock on Sunday at 8 p.m. London time, but we also then do a webinar session for I'm just checking sensors tonight. And then we do a webinar for our ZP Developer Zone members on London at 8 a.m. So first of all, apologies, I'll be doing the cortisol stuff more heavily on Thursday at 8 a.m. and I will also be not covering the cortisol quite so heavily this evening. So anyway, my apologies for that, but let me dive into this evening's webinar. I will be talking quite heavily about screen printed electrodes this evening, so I am let me dive into that and we'll essentially get on with it. Alright, so as I say, this is the news from Zimmer and Peacock for this week. For the first thing I want to cover is sweat patches. So we do get a lot of people who are quite interested in monitoring analytes in the sweat. The sort of whole idea is you will take sort of a screen printed biosensor, screen printed electrode of this type, and you'll be able to immobilize it onto the skin, and you will be able to kind of collect the sweat, and the sweat will basically run over the surface of the sensor and bring any analytes to the sensor face. So people, this is actually linked to the cortisol questions that we've been getting. So Zimmer and Peacock, we are interested in cortisol, and I will cover that on Thursday at 8 a.m. London time in the ZP Developer Zone members webinar. But what goes along with the cortisol sensors and anything that you're trying to measure in sweat, be it hydration, be it lactate, be it cortisol, you actually need the sweat patch itself. So we have developed this little patch. You can sort of see it where my mouse is at the moment, and the idea there is it collects the sweat, and there's a conduit or a microfluidic path that brings the sweat to the sensor, and then it dumps it to waste outside of the sensor, so you get a continuous flow through the sensor. And that's probably really important, because otherwise you're just going to get a big a build up of material in the sensor. So first thing is this is linked to cortisol. I won't be able to talk about the cortisol sensor tonight, but I do want to say that we've had this sweat patch at Zimmer and Peacock for quite some time, but we haven't made it available to others. But I mean, we are responsive to people's sort of needs and requests from us. So if you're at all aware of our developer zone, we have members of the developer zone. It is free to join, and we have a forum, and I'm completely aware that in that forum, you know, one of the questions that's at the top of the list at the moment is about sweat sensors, and the inquirer wants to know about cortisol in sweat. So like I say, I'll cover that, but just to say, in the meantime, we have made the sweat patch itself actually available. We'll put a kit out there. The kit allows you to construct 100 of these patches. Now you also have to buy the biosensors or the screen printed electrodes to go with it. So in terms of biosensors, you know, you can go to our sort of biosensors page. I think the ones that will be most interesting to people will be things like the sort of the sodium sensors, maybe the potassium sensors, the lactate sensors, and I'm going to work very hard and try and get a cortisol sensor up on the website as well. The other part that might be kind of quite interesting to people who are interested in measuring materials in the sweat is also obviously the electronics that we have. So we have this kind of easy flex format, so that it's originally why we designed the easy flex, for this kind of measurement of analytes in the sweat. Yeah, there's a good question just came up online. So I didn't really say it very well, but this is, we're streaming this live, and it's a good question. So how much material is actually needed to measure? 4 microliters. So if you look at, and it's definitely a good question, and I'll answer the question a bit more in detail now. So you will need approximately 4 microliters to fill this channel and this sensor up. Now, if you were really doing a development, you could start optimizing this, because essentially, if you decrease the volume in here by either making it thinner, when I say thinner, I mean at the moment it's probably about 125 micrometers thick, but if you thin that down, you would reduce the volume, and also narrowing the channel up as well. No, I was just looking at the question online. So the way the sweat patch works. So if somebody's trying to measure, first of all, if somebody's trying to measure sweat, the first thing they need some way of collecting the sweat. So the sweat patch is a way of collecting the sweat. So it's a microfluidic construction that brings sweat to the sensor. Now, the next part is, what are you going to sense? So you can either, for example, if you want to make your own cortisol sensor, then my recommendation is going to be, go to our screen printed electrodes, and I would go for the hyper value electrodes, because they're relatively cheap, and you would construct a cortisol sensor on top of that working electrode. So that's one. So the sweat patch and cortisol sensor, they are linked together, because you need a sweat patch, which is really a term for just microfluidics in it's just really, it's the microfluidics. How are you going to bring the sweat to the sensor? So you need some sort of microfluidic construction, and then you need to sense it. So you've got a few choices. Construct your own cortisol sensor, which is, you'd go to a company like Zimmer and Peacock. You would find a screen printed electrode that you thought you could work upon, and you would, if you needed a gold one, I would be recommending our gold 303 electrodes. If you thought you needed platinum, I'd be recommending our platinum 303. And if you needed carbon, I would probably be recommending our hyper value electrode, because it's just that much lower cost. So the cortisol sensor has to fit within the sweat patch. The sweat patch is only to bring the sample to the sensor. So the reason I kind of diverged there is we're going live at the moment, and there a few questions kind of came online whilst I was answering the question. So let me just do a quick sort of summary on the sweat patch. The sweat patch is only the microfluidics that you need to construct on top of a screen printed electrode. Now, the sweat patch that we make works with our value electrodes and our hyper value electrodes and our biosensors. So you need the sweat patch, and then you need either the biosensors, which are all listed here on the website if you're following on the webinar, or it will work with our screen printer electrodes, which is our hyper value electrodes, which I think are one of the best options, or our value electrodes, especially if you need gold and platinum. Now the real question, I've had a question, as I say, that came through the developers zone, which is somebody wanted to know whether they could buy the sweat patch, and the answer is yes. But the real question was, they also want to develop a cortisol sensor. In that case, I haven't answered the question about cortisol sensor. As I say, I'll have to do that at 8 a.m. on Thursday. Yeah, and I'm getting a question here is, how is the sweat created? Now the sweat patch that we are discussing here is really created. Yeah, it's created by physical exercise. There are people who are interested in measuring analytes like on the skin and in the sweat, but sweat by its definition means that we have physically created the sweat. We've done some exercise. If people are interested in measuring like cortisol in a non-perspiring person, then I'm going to start recommending different technologies to them. So we seem to be having a cortisol theme this evening. So if somebody came to me and said, look, the subject is not going to be sweating, but I still want to measure cortisol on them, then I would be talking to them about using something like a wire sensor, because these kind of sensors, they're called a transdermal sensor. You can push them through the skin, which are probably what I do in this video here. You can push them through the skin. That's for the electrical connection. So I'm just explaining it in the video. And here we are, and you push it through the skin. So this kind of sensor would work in a non-perspiring person. So that's for non-sweating people, because then you don't need them to sweat. A kind of sensor that's becoming very popular at the moment, and I think it deserves to be popular as well, is what we call microneedles as well. So I'll just go down to those as well, microneedles. So I'm going to do a quick summary in a minute, because we've said an awful lot in the space of something like 13 minutes. But there's also microneedles, which are sort of a way of doing a transdermal sensor, i.e. through the skin, without it being sort of too invasive. So these are all microneedles. So let me back up slightly and say, now, in this vlog, we're here to talk, we give some news from Zimmer and Peacock, and we're also here to answer questions that come from members of the developer zone and people who are generally interested. So one of the questions we've had this week is, can I buy the sweat patch? The quick answer is yes, you can buy the sweat patches off Zimmer and Peacock, and many people are interested in using the sweat patch because actually they're quite interested in measuring cortisol. And then I said what I'm saying is, on Thursday this week I will talk about cortisol sensors, because I haven't had time to put together the material this evening. But if you want to measure cortisol in the sweat, then you're going to need a sweat patch. That's available on the ZP website. You'll need a cortisol sensor, which you can either develop, and I would recommend you developing it upon our hypervalue electrodes or our value screen printed electrodes, or let me talk about a cortisol sensor. There was a question, is how do you interact with Zimmer and Peacock? Let me just do a quick Google search, free Q&A with Zimmer and Peacock. So there's lots of ways of interacting with us. The lowest cost way of interacting with us at Zimmer and Peacock, well, the lowest way is obviously use the ZP Academy. We put lots of training material up on the ZP Academy. There's at least 2 free courses that are available in the ZP Academy. There's the ZP Developer Zone. If you're not a member of the ZP Developer Zone, but you have technical questions for Zimmer and Peacock, then you really have to join the Developer Zone. Now, if you're a private company, people don't want to discuss their questions and answers, in a public forum. So at that point, there's private consulting. Or we're also, well, it's not just consultancy, we're also what they call an ISO 13485 contract developer and manufacturer of electrochemical sensors. That's what we do. So we do contract development, contract manufacturing for people. If people are interested in those services, they can contact us. If they're just interested in asking a few private questions, they consult with us. If they want really just to be part of and ask sort of questions and they're happy to do it in a more public forum, then join the ZP Developer Zone. You'll see that in our forums, here we've got we've had something like 32 questions, and we've essentially answered all of them, and this only went up a few months ago. So that's the best way of having a low cost interaction with, let's say, with Zimmer and Peacock. Now I'm going to slightly back up now and say I'm sorry to spend quite so long talking about sweat patches this evening, but there were so many elements to it, and I still have to finish the discussion on cortisol sensors, so I apologize, but I will do that on Thursday this week. I just want to cover something else this evening as well, which is something that's fairly close to my heart, which is a comment on what's wrong with R&D screen printed electrodes. So we get asked, all the time that, if you look at Zimmer and Peacock, we make screen printed electrodes that look like this. This is one of the screen printed electrodes that's from one of our from another company. It looks like this. Now Zimmer and Peacock, I tend to recommend screen printed electrodes that actually look like this. So if you look at our website, we do have an awfully large range of screen printed electrodes. So we have when we first started the business, we actually started with these kind of electrodes like this. But these days, I'm much more heavily recommending electrodes that look like this. And the question is, why? Now I'm going to answer the question, what's the difference? Now I'm going to answer it, or not what's the difference, why have we done this? I'm going to answer it by, partly using the website, but I'm also going to use one of these sensors to kind of to illustrate the point. So this is a glucose sensor. Sort of I would call glucose sensors the kind of grandfather of biosensors. Now, when you look at this glucose sensor, I'd ask you a question: does it look like this, or does it look more like this? Now, I know it's not easy to say. It's I consider it a sort of slightly trick question. There's more about this electrode. There's more similarity between this and this than there is between this and this. Now let me answer that question properly, right? So this is a glucose sensor. This is the glucose meter with it that goes with it. You click it in, it turns on immediately. Alright, so that's pretty good. The next thing I'll do is just going to prick my finger very quickly. So, excuse me. Alright, so just getting the drop of blood. So I've got my drop of blood going. Good. Right, now I'm going to... Right. So this is going to quickly do a countdown. There's a few things to discuss here. Right, so it's come back and told me that my blood glucose is 8 millimolar, which is not too surprising. I only ate an hour or so ago. So the reason I've put this up like this is to say, at Zimmer Peacock we are different. People that come to us and say, I want an R&D electrode, and I'm very interested in these circular electrodes that are like 4 millimeters in diameter. And the quick answer is we do have those, but we don't push them or promote them quite so heavily as we do our other ones. And the answer is this: that our mindsets are, we want to work with people who want to go to market. So if you want to go to market, then in the end, the grandfather of screen printed electrodes and biosensors is a glucose sensor. So we're designing R&D screen printed electrodes that are like traditional glucose sensors and not these circular type electrodes, even though we do have them. Now the first thing that's wrong with the sort of traditional screen printed electrodes I'm sorry, just reading a note there. What's wrong with these traditional types of electrodes is their size. So let me just go to a size calculator here. So size is really important in screen printed electrodes because some screen printed electrodes that are on the market are something like 30 millimeters long and 10 millimeters wide. Now that means if we were manufacturing those in quite modest volumes, and when I say modest volumes, if we were manufacturing something like 540 of them, that's really quite low volume, it would end up costing about €8.29 to manufacture those. It's quite expensive. Now, with our hypervalue electrodes, which are smaller, then in fact now it costs much less to manufacture them. Now, and if we increase the volumes, so if we increase the volumes, it's much less to. Now, if we increase the volumes of these, let's take it to a lot. Then we can get these down to like 55 cents each. So, what's wrong with screen printed electrodes? The way of manufacturing screen printed electrodes like this, they're fine, we make them at Zimmer Peacock, and they're okay for R&D, but they're too large to be commercially viable when you're trying to make when you're trying to make things like glucose sensors or lactate sensors or any type of sensor. They're too big. So that's why we make sensors like this, and this is why I try to promote those types of sensors to people, because I know that if you're going to manufacture these things at volume, your investors, your board, people are going to say, look, you need to get the cost out of this product. So you can't start with a large sensor because you'll never get the cost out of it. And I think, these little screen printed electrodes sort of make my point for me, that they're very small. So I was asking the question, what's wrong with screen printed electrodes? And I said, well, they're too large often. That's one of the problems. The other thing is, you would have noticed when I did that test that I pricked my finger. I had a drop of blood. I didn't add the blood to the sensor. I just touched the sensor. I just touched the sensor with the I just touched the sensor with the blood. So let me do it again. It's a bit gross, I know, but so I'm answering the question, what's wrong with screen printed electrodes? Now, this is going to be my sample. So I'm going to have there's my sample of blood. Alright? This electrode just sucks up the blood automatically. It's doing something called capillary fill. Right, I'm still at 8 millimolar. It's doing something called capillary fill. So what's wrong with electrodes that are designed like this? They're not designed in any way to work well with capillary fill. And if you're not sure what capillary fill really is, that's fine. We'll just go to the website, and a video that people like Hasim have seen before. This is a fairly good video showing you how an electrode can pull the sample onto it if it's been designed with capillary fill. So at Zimmer Peacock, we know that in the end people need to get to market, and when they get to market, they're going to have a way of moving the sample onto the sensor in a fairly automatic way. And the best way to do that, in our opinion, is capillary fill. All these types of glucose sensors use capillary fill. These types of electrodes don't work well with capillary fill. That's why we design our electrodes like this, because actually then they do work with capillary fill. So at Zimmer Peacock, what's wrong with R&D screen printed electrodes? They're too big. They're not designed to really be working with capillary fill. And so at ZP we have a couple of solutions for it. I think one of the nicest ways is, if you look on our website, you will see that if you are a member of the ZP Developer Zone, we make these files, which are for 3D printing microfluidics, we make these files available to you. Now they're €125 normally. They're for 3D printing, and we make those free to people if they're members of the ZP Developer Zone. So I'm going to back up slightly now and sort of, I've been answering the question, what's wrong with sensors for R&D, and they're too big, and you need to be thinking about how are you going to bring the sample to the sensor. So at Zimmer & Peacock, the electrodes that we are recommending, we're thinking about that question, and we have a couple of solutions on the website. There's the capillary fill solution, and there's also the 3D printed microfluidics solution as well. So we are thinking ahead. I think people are thinking about, the nice thing about a circular electrode like that is it's nice and big. You can get your pipette, you can pipette on it, and you can dry it down, and you can make a nice reproducible surface on that. But it won't work well when you want to do capillary fill. And I've used the glucose sensor to demonstrate that capillary fill is actually important. Now, the other thing that's kind of wrong with them is the geometry. So when you look at ZP electrodes, we quite like having parallel electrodes, and it's linked to the capillary fill earlier on. Now people say to us, oh well, how do I functionalize a rectangular electrode? You just do a little dot here and a little dot here and a little dot here and a little dot here. It's fine, and they all merge together. So it's important to get the right geometry on your screen printed electrode, even R&D. And why do we make these electrodes rectangular? Because we know that they're going to eventually have to be in a capillary channel or some sort of microfluidics channel, and we expect that. Now you notice when I did this experiment earlier on with the glucose strip, I didn't start the assay. I actually brought the sensor to my finger. So I'll do it again. So I've got a sensor in here. The assay hasn't started. Whoops daisy. I prick my finger. I get the drop of blood. I'm not going to start the assay. I'm not. I mean, I know that many of you got diabetics in the family, so you know this already. But I don't start the assay. The assay starts automatically. So and it runs automatically. Now I'm going to explain why it starts automatically. Still 8 millimolar. Okay. Right. So the reason they start automatically is because of this. The blood comes into the sensor. The blood comes over the first electrode, over the second electrode, and then it touches the third electrode and completes the circuit. So I have a signal that's flatlined until the blood completes, and then the signal jumps up. And that's really one of the things that's what's wrong with screen printed electrodes, is they design these circular types of electrodes, but we all know that they're actually, if you look at a glucose strip, the blood kind of wicks down a capillary channel, and the assay starts automatically. That's why the electrode geometries that ZP is recommending are designed to fit into a capillary, so that the sample will wash over the electrodes, and when it reaches the last electrode, it completes the circuit, and that will trigger the electronics to start automatically. I didn't need to start this assay. Nobody hit go. It just started because the circuit was completed by the blood. So at Zimmer & Peacock, what's wrong with R&D electrodes, that are of a kind of circular nature? What's wrong with them is they're not designed with the final automatic start of the assay in mind, but we really do think about that at ZP. So I'll just go back one square. Right, and now the other thing that's kind of I just had a comment off a guy called Ali, just saying that's very repeatable. I said I'm pretty impressed myself. I did 3 readings and got 8 millimolar each time. I was like, yeah, it's very repeatable, I'll give you that. Now what's wrong with screen printed electrodes for the R&D market? And it's really quality. Now if you come to Zimmer & Peacock, and some of you definitely will be, you know who you are, this is the kind of environment that we work in. So here are our guys in one of our labs. Now I'm going to talk about, the quality bit's going to kick in a minute. Now what's going on here is we've got a 12 channel potentiostat, and you can see that we're busy testing away. Now what's happening here is this is a here we're actually testing 12 electrodes in parallel. The scientists going around adding test solution, and they're all being tested. So I'm showing you how we're doing the testing, but now I'm going to show you why we're doing that testing. We're doing something called wafer mapping, and we are the only company that does this wafer mapping. People really complain about the quality of screen printed electrodes, and the reason being is most screen printed electrodes are not really tested before they actually leave the factory. Now at Zimmer & Peacock we do wafer mapping. Ali was just making a comment on the live stream now that was very repeatable, but what we do is at Zimmer & Peacock we if we make a batch of screen printed electrodes, we test them with ferrocyanide and make sure that they, at least by cyclovoltammetry, all look the same. And I think that very few companies, or if any other than us, actually do this. And what this allows us to do, it allows us to make sure that obviously our working electrode and our roughnesses are consistent, because we get consistent peak height. It tells us about our peak separation. If they're terribly separated, we know that we've got a real conductivity issue, and if they're closer together, then we know that's good. Especially with gold electrodes, it's really important to test the electrodes, because gold is very good at getting tarnished. So at Zimmer & Peacock, we are an ISO 13485 manufacturer of electrodes, and what makes us really different is the environment in which we're testing our electrodes before we ship them, and the fact that we're doing so much testing before we actually ship them. I mean, this data set here is something like 50 screen printed electrodes being tested before they ship. And I haven't got time to talk about it this evening, but at Zimmer & Peacock we have a free cloud-based system called Julie. Julie is a cloud-based system where you can actually upload data, analyze the data. And so at Zimmer & Peacock, the reason Julie exists is because we actually do wafer mapping. So as much as we make Julie free so if you're a user of a Zimmer & Peacock potentiostat, or you're a user of something like a Palm Sense potentiostat, you can gather your own data, upload it to Julie, analyze it in Julie, save it in Julie, share the data in Julie with your colleagues. But we developed it for us. We developed because we needed a way of checking screen printed electrodes before they shipped, and that's why Julie actually exists. So nowadays it's becoming much more. If you're interested in Julie, I would definitely attend the the webinars that we do. But you can get Julie's free to use. If you're interested in Julie, just FYI, you can go to the website and set up an account with there. So I'm sort of so far I've been asked a question about we can provide screen printed electrodes that like this, but I'm really going to recommend to people that actually they use the screen printed electrodes that look like this. And I think it's because the size is correct, so that if you really go to market, it'll be correct. It means they work with capillary fill, and you can actually get capillary fill solutions, either 3D printed ones or capillary fill solutions off our website. They're very similar to glucose sensors, so that's gives you a sense that actually we're building something that can become commercially viable, as opposed to just an R&D product. One of the things that's wrong with screen printed electrodes in general on the R&D market is they're not highly tested, but at Zimmer & Peacock we do this. So at Zimmer & Peacock, if somebody comes to me and says, look, I want a gold electrode, we provide gold electrodes, and we provide them in packs of like 3,000. But actually, what I really would like people to do, when I say packs of 3,000, that's 3,000 for our circular electrodes. But the honest answer is, if you want to have gold electrodes of Zimmer and Peacock, then I would recommend our gold 303s. You can buy them in packs of like 10, packs of 2, packs of 15. You can buy them in lower packs. If you want the platinums, it's exactly the same price. You can buy them in packs of 2, packs of 10, packs of 15. If you want carbon electrodes, I know I've said it already, but I'm really going to recommend the hyper value carbon electrodes. They're 99 cents each. They're very low cost, and that's going to be my recommendation. Right, so I've said an awful lot on that particular subject, and I might go on now with some other news from Zimmer and Peacock. So I think this is really quite good news. I mean, at Zimmer and Peacock, there's a lot of, many of you are, we've all got academic connections. I'm a honorary lecturer at Swansea University. I know that Ali is also an academic. Hasim, who's also a ZP Developer Zone member, has some strong ties to Leicester University. So we all have strong academic connections. I find it really heartening that one of our commercial collaborators, a company called Exhalation, they are really out there making this, or not making, they're in partnership with Zimmer and Peacock making this COVID-19 sensor for testing on the breath. And I'm glad that actually people are starting to, really notice now, and it's starting to make its way into the mainstream media, let's say. So, as much as there's every day there's a new paper on COVID-19 sensor, but those are papers, so I really want to promote the fact that this technology is not in an academic paper, it's actually in hospitals, and that's it is important. So I suppose the mission statement at Zimmer and Peacock is the mission statement is simple enough. We want to get our collaborators and our clients onto the market, including for things like COVID-19. So in this product, what the shielding is it's basically because the lady's actually blowing into the device, it's condensing the breath, it's analysing the virus directly on the breath. It's pretty cool, and I'm delighted that the media is starting to pay attention to this. Something that makes ZP a little bit different is people like Hasim, who are members of the ZP Developer Zone. Hasim has known us for many years now, and he's seen the company sort of grow up and expand, and now we're starting to actually either develop or acquire IP. So this is an example from Zimmer and Peacock this week, where a company is no longer, essentially they've gone out of business, but what we've been able to do is come in and buy the IP. So we've bought some IP on the use of purines in the detection of ischemia and stroke, and we've also acquired the rights to ruthenium purple and the use of gold microelectrodes. So this is important for a company like Zimmer and Peacock, that as we grow, you need to maintain something called freedom to operate, and patents is a great way of maintaining that freedom to operate. So many of you have been following us for a while now. You've seen the way the company's grown and matured. 4,000 square meter facility, over 50 employees, ISO 13485. Now acquiring a bigger and bigger patent portfolio. So just wanted to mention that we bought those patents this week. I think this is this is a very important article to my heart. That at Zimmer and Peacock, the number of academic collaborations we have going on, I think is much larger than the size of company that we actually are. What we're doing. This is one university alone where we've been supervising 4 master's students this year. One of them was on applications or apps for biosensing. If you know Zimmer and Peacock, you know that we've got the food sense technology. You know that we're measuring the quality of food. You may not know that actually we're doing an aquaculture program, and in this aquaculture program, I really appreciate Hader waiting on, because actually we're developing a cortisol sensor here for the measurement of stress in fish. So we're making an implantable sensor for measuring the stress in fish. We're making a glucose sensor for generally measuring the health of the fish. I mean, this is Zimmer and Peacock, so glucose sensors are super easy for us. And then the more challenging one is the cortisol, but we have a nice program running on that. We've been supervising another student for making a fructose sensor for food and beverage, so that's been going pretty well. And we've been working on a screen printed electrode for measuring the quality of beer. So I just want to kind of say that Zimmer and Peacock, it's still a company that's growing, and just with one university department, we've been looking after 4 students this year. And the reason we look after these students is because it gives us a really great way of training people, learning a lot from them, but at the same time we can also then hopefully employ these people at the end of it. So we're coming to the end now. I realize this is like 42 minutes we've been speaking, so I sort of want to apologize, but I think there's been a lot of material to cover. So this week, the news from Zimmer and Peacock is we did have our Developer Zone webinar this week. We talked about the carbon screen printed electrodes, E. coli. We talked about EIS, electrochemical impedance spectroscopy. So for example, if you were making a cortisol sensor, then I think one of the best methods is actually going to be EIS. And so in that webinar, we talked about EIS, uploading the data to Julie and processing the data in Julie. So I really, that was pretty useful. We also put a little note out there this week that at Zimmer and Peacock, we are contract developers and contract manufacturers of biosensors. And I've even mentioned COVID-19 this week. So with our collaborators, it's in hospitals being used. So hooray! I'm really happy. But what we are saying is, people are still inquiring to us. Can you make us a COVID-19 sensor? Our kind of news is that obviously COVID-19 will be with us for a long time, but there will be enough biosensing technology on the market now that if you haven't developed it already, then it might be a little late. And we would actually say, start your biosensor company. Come and talk to Zimmer and Peacock about being a partner with us. But let's talk, let's talk about, what other biosensors are required. Is it going to be COVID-20? Is it going to be COVID-21? Is it going to be influenza? So we have to talk about, what's going to be the next pandemic. And the really good thing about ZP is that we actually have a market analysis group. So we can essentially answer those kind of business questions about, the business question being, what is next? So at ZP we do have our market analysis group. And we did put a note up there this week about measuring nitrate in the soil. I haven't mentioned nitrate too much at all, in fact at all this week, but at Zimmer and Peacock, we make screen printed electrodes just like this one, and we convert them into biosensors. And one of the sensors that we've developed is also a sensor for measuring nitrates in soil. So we've also put some notes out about that. So let me summarize, and I'm sorry that was long this week, but thank you Ali and Hasim and Hadia, I appreciate it. Hadia had a question. So Hadia wanted to know about one-on-one consulting with Zimmer and Peacock. So I appreciate the question. So the quick answer is, if you want one-on-one consulting with Zimmer and Peacock, the quickest way of doing it is coming down to services, going down to engineering services, which I've got to find. People just add that to cart, check it out. Sorry, couldn't. I have to probably do it again. So essentially, you can come to our website, buy an hour with us, and then that will be we'll give you a sort of hours consulting and answer your questions. So I will summarize for this week and say thank you very much. We've touched on cortisol because we talked about the sweat patch. I said I was going to do more on it on Thursday, But whilst we were actually doing the webinar, we then touched upon electrochemical impedance spectroscopy, which if you're making a cortisol sensor, it's probably worth considering, and we can talk more about that on Thursday. So we talked about that sweat patch. We did talk about screen printed electrodes, and I said people are interested in these kind of carbon type circular screen printed electrodes, and that's the Zimmer Peacock one. We make them available, but we make them available in quite high volumes, something like 3,000. If you want to get low volumes, please go for the value or hyper value electrodes from us. And I really want people to, even though these are lower cost than these, but I really want people to go for these because these are more commercially viable when you go to volume. These will work better with microfluidics. These will allow the assay to automatically start because of the geometry. And at Zimmer Peacock, we keep the quality really high because we actually do this wafer mapping, and that sort of makes us different. I'm very happy that this week the COVID-19 sensor that's actually in use in these Italian hospitals is gathering gathering interest. So I appreciate the Italian press for picking that up. And you can see that there's no limit if you're interested in biosensing. This week we finished with the nitrate sensor. We've touched on cortisol, touched on glucose. You can see that there's such a plethora of interesting things to do in biosensing that I definitely recommend you all jumping on board or jumping in rather. And so what I would say is this: if you're interested in Zimmer and Peacock and being part of the story, we have our normal website. But you can also join the ZP Developer Zone and be part of that conversation. Otherwise, the website that we do have is absolutely packed full of information. So I will sign off now. Appreciate you guys being online and listening to the webinar this week. To my friend in Singapore who wants to know more about cortisol sensors, I will add it. And I know I have my friend in India as well, but I will talk about more on Thursday at 8 AM in our Developer Zone webinar there. Okay, thanks guys. I do appreciate it. And speak to many of you on Thursday. Alright, take care. Bye bye.